is Jennifer Rose, and I'm a consultant with Futures Without Violence, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. Our webinar today is titled, So You Didn't Receive a Hard Hat at Orientation, a look at the occupational hazards of trauma work. Our webinar today is part of an ongoing series of webinars focusing on children's exposure to violence. And today's webinar is funded by the Defending Childhood Initiative. You will receive emails notifying you of additional upcoming webinars in this series. We typically have 1 or 2 webinars each month focusing on different topics and highlighting different innovations in the work of children's exposure to violence. Our webinar today will run until 3:30 Eastern Time. During the webinar, your phone will be muted. You may ask questions or report technical issues using the chat function on the left part of your screen. Before I introduce Carmen with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention at the U.S. Department of Justice, I'm going to hand it over to Mie to just talk to us a little bit about the technology we have available today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mie Fukuda. Just going to put the slide up for you. And I'm a Children and Youth Program Specialist at Futures Without Violence. Thanks again for joining us for today's webinar. If you wish to listen to the presentation over your phone, please dial 1-888-850-4523 and enter the passcode 418086#. Once you've connected, please dial *6 so that you can be muted during the call to minimize background noise. I also want to point out that at the end of the presentation, we'll have a short Q&A section dedicated to answering your questions. But feel free to type questions into the chat box, which is located on the lower right-hand side of your screen throughout the presentation. For technical support during the presentation, you can send me a private chat message by clicking the chat box drop-down menu with the little lines on the top and choosing the Start Chat with Hosts feature. You can also call 1-800-422-3623 for Adobe Tech Support. At the end of the webinar, you'll be prompted to answer a short survey. We really appreciate your participation and feedback, and a recording of today's presentation as well as the PDF version of the PowerPoint slides will be made available on our website after the webinar. I also just want to quickly point out the captions box that you can see on the lower part of your screen. It is set on auto scroll, but if you'd like to scroll back to see what was said before, you can just scroll by clicking on the little arrow there. Once you do that, the auto scroll feature will unlock. So to lock it back up, please click the auto scroll box and that will happen. So thanks again everyone for joining us, and we really hope that you enjoy the session. Back to you, Jennifer.
Great, thanks so much, Mie. Well, before we get to our presenters, I want to take a minute to introduce again Carmen Santiago. She's with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention at the U.S. Department of Justice, and just a key supporter and partner of ours in this work. So Carmen, you want to take over?
Sure, thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Carmen Santiago. I'm a program manager with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention at the U.S. Department of Justice. We are delighted to be partnering with Futures Without Violence to provide this series of webinars on children exposed to violence as part of the Defending Childhood Initiative. Former Attorney General Eric Holder launched the Defending Childhood Initiative in 2010 to address a national crisis, the exposure of America's children to violence as victims and also as witnesses. In 2009, DOJ studies show that more than 60% of children surveyed were exposed to violence within the past year, either directly or indirectly. In fact, children are more likely to be exposed to violence and crime than adults. Slide 2, please. This initiative is being supported across many federal agencies, as you can see from the slide. Next slide. This initiative has three main goals: to prevent and reduce children's exposure to violence, to mitigate the harmful effects of violence, and to spread knowledge across the country on how to help. Slide 4. Defending Childhood has several strategies and components. First, there are 8 demonstration sites across the country, including 2 tribal sites. These sites are developing and implementing a range of prevention, intervention, and treatment strategies to meet the needs of all children in the community from newborns to youth through age 17. There is a research evaluation component led by the Center for Court Innovation, and in December of 2012, the Attorney General released a task force report outlining important recommendations for how our nation can and should respond to children exposed to violence. On this slide, there is a link for you to access that report. Further, a second task force was created to make recommendations for Native American and Alaskan Native children, and those recommendations were released last year. Finally, there is a training and technical assistance strategy led by Futures Without Violence, so we can advance our collective understanding about what works. It is an ambitious undertaking, but a problem this widespread requires us to create ambitious, comprehensive solutions. We invite those of you who are listening to this webinar today to find ways within your own communities to protect children and to help them heal and thrive. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for being with us and for being our partner in this work. So let's get started. We cannot deny that the interest and desire for this type of information is widespread. We filled up this webinar in less than 24 hours after posting the publicity. And that for us is so reassuring that we're recognizing that to do trauma work, we have to recognize the impact of trauma on all of us. And our presenters today have spent a lot of time thinking about and are going to help us explore the impact and ways of taking care of ourselves so that we can continue doing this important work. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers today. Not only are they fantastic speakers, but they are one of the sites in the Defending Childhood initiative. So we appreciate them doing this webinar for us today. So Rebecca Brown works at the Maine Behavioral Health Care as the Grants Clinical Manager for 2 federal grant projects, the Maine Children's Trauma Response Initiative through SAMHSA and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and Portland Defending Childhood, part of the Department of Justice's Defending Childhood initiative. Both of these projects are focusing on responding to the issue of childhood exposure to violence and trauma. In her current position, Rebecca oversees the implementation of trauma-informed evidence-based treatment and interventions locally and throughout the state of Maine, and has extensive experience providing training on a wide range of topics related to childhood trauma and traumatic stress. Rebecca has received advanced training and practice in 3 evidence-based trauma treatments: trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, child-parent psychotherapy, and child and family traumatic stress intervention. She is also the co-chair of the Domestic Violence Collaborative Work Group for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Rebecca attended Boston College Graduate School of
You are no longer muted.
Certificate in Child and Family Policy and Management from the University of Southern Maine. She's worked in the field of mental health.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Next, we have Allegra Hirsch-Wright. She is the Clinical Implementation Coordinator for the Maine Children's Trauma Response Initiative, the SAMHSA-funded National Child Traumatic Stress Network projects site, and a member of Portland's Defending Childhood, a DOJ-funded Defending Childhood project site. Allegra oversees implementation of evidence-based trauma treatment statewide and provides training on multiple topics related to childhood exposure and trauma. Allegra sits on the Child Traumatic Grief Collaborative Group and is a contributing member of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Work Group, or NCTSN. Allegra has co-authored an article on children's childhood exposure to violence and contributed to fact sheets and national website on secondary traumatic stress. It is my pleasure to hand it over to the two of them.
Hi, thank you for having us today. Can everyone, or Jennifer, can you hear us okay? Because it just said we were muted.
I can, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So, this is Rebecca speaking now. Thank you for having us. We want to really appreciate Futures as well as our Defending Childhood sponsors and having us to talk about this important issue. As mentioned in our bios, we work with the Defending Childhood Initiative here in Portland, as well as with a SAMHSA-funded project through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network called the Maine Children's Trauma Response Initiative. And I think we both, I speak for both of us when we say we feel very fortunate to be able to have the time to explore this work, what we've been doing over the last, I say, 9 years or so related to these federal initiatives. So thank you for having us. We also, as I'm going to put up the objective slides, people can read what kind of our objectives are for today, but to also acknowledge that oftentimes when we are doing training on secondary trauma, it really, so much of it is about relationships and connections and how we explore the impact of this work on us as providers, and then kind of thinking about how we sustain ourselves in the work. And we want to acknowledge that, being in an electronic format and being over the phone sometimes doesn't allow us, the same connection and opportunities for connection that with participants in this forum. So we hope that we can make this as engaging and, a few interactive opportunities throughout, but really just encourage all of you on attending this webinar to think about the connections and supports you have within your own organizations that help you sustain yourselves in the difficult work of working with either children or adults exposed to trauma. We didn't feel like we could really start talking about the issue of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue and the impact of trauma work as an occupational hazard without kind of coming to some contextual understanding of what trauma is. So just wanted to take a couple moments to talk about what is trauma. When we're talking about trauma work, what does that mean? And so here are a few definitions about trauma. But in general, what we really want to talk about is that trauma is something that tends to be a collective experience. It's not something that happens to just a distinct group of people. It's really something that is very common in our communities, in our society, in our culture, and that many of us have experienced our own experiences of potentially traumatic events and may have trauma reactions from those, may or may not have. So again, thinking about this as trauma as something that is not something that's inherent within us, but something that is a common experience that many of us share throughout different times in our lives. It really, when we're talking about trauma, thinking about this overwhelming demand placed on a physiological human system. Oftentimes, we're talking about potentially traumatic events. We're talking about events that happen in our lives that lead to a feeling of threat, vulnerability, and loss of control. And many of the reactions that can, some of the adverse reactions that can result from experiencing traumatic events really are related to some of those in-time experiences of loss of control, vulnerability, and fear and threat. So the second definition here around this being an external experience, so again, not something that we want to always be thinking about looking at the issue of trauma as something that happens to people, not something that's wrong with people, and looking at the reactions not necessarily as from a place of pathology, but also from really expected reactions to very abnormal events in people's lives. So many of even the adverse reactions that are referred to in this definition have to do with things that we would expect following trauma. So that our bodies are designed to handle trauma and to respond to trauma and to keep us in a survival mode. And so oftentimes when those reactions carry over into our day-to-day life, that's when we see some of the adverse effects. And I'll give you kind of a very brief example when we're talking about trauma, thinking about a child who may experience domestic violence in their home. and when the violence is going on between their caregivers, they run and hide in their closet. Now, if we were to ask you kind of what, if you would consider that hiding in the closet to be an adaptive response, my guess is most of you would say yes, because the child is removing themselves from the unsafe situation, they're getting themselves out of danger. It's really an adaptive coping skill in the moment that violence is occurring. If we take that same child and we place them in a classroom setting, and anytime anything is upsetting or just, uncomfortable, they get up and they run out of the classroom, all of a sudden, I think if I were to ask you, is that an adaptive coping skill, you might change your answer a little bit, because what happens when kids would respond like that in a classroom setting is they get either identified potentially as having behavior issues, they may need additional support, and we start to look at the same behavior that was adaptive at the time of trauma is a maladaptive response. And so we always want to be talking about trauma from a place of looking at what are the sources and the reasons behind a certain behavior and reaction. How can we help people develop more adaptive coping skills to deal with what they've experienced in the past? So again, I know we're not providing a webinar on the issue of childhood exposure to violence per se, but looking at and understanding the issue of trauma, and then how do those same reactions that may be adverse impacts for people directly experiencing trauma, how does that carry over into ourselves as we do this work, as we work with people who've had these experiences and maybe have had some of our own experiences in our past? And so that's what kind of the context that we wanted to frame starting off. Also, before we move forward, we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to practice what we're going to preach today around self-care. And just taking a moment, you may be in an office by yourself, you may be with a group of your colleagues, and just get grounded as we begin to explore some material about how this work impacts us. So I would ask you all to sit upright in your chair, or if you happen to be sitting on the floor, upright as much as you can with a straight spine. And put your feet flat on the floor. And close your eyes or lower your gaze to the ground. And start to notice the sensations you feel in your body. Feel the floor under your feet. Feel the chair or floor underneath your body supporting you, grounding you. And I want everyone to take a moment and take a deep breath in through their nose. And out through your mouth. And I'd like to ask everyone who's listening today to do that one more time. So again, noticing the sensations of your body, feeling grounded in your chair or on the floor, depending on where you're sitting, and taking a deep breath in. And an exhale out. And so now hopefully we're all a little bit more grounded than we were just a few seconds ago, and just really showing you that this is a very simple strategy that all of us have the ability to do any number of times in our day to ground us in the work that we're doing and kind of get back in touch with ourselves and what we need to move forward and sustain ourselves in doing work with people who've experienced trauma. So thank you all for doing that. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Allegra Hurst-Wright.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit of a personal story of my own experience with secondary trauma. So I am the parent of a 17-year-old who is going to be entering his senior year of high school in the fall. Throughout his entire 17 years, he's gone to school. He went to preschool before he started kindergarten. And during that time, as we all know, there have been an unfortunate number of school shootings that have occurred. And when they have occurred, my reaction to them, I think, was pretty similar to most folks' reactions. I felt very sad. I felt angry. I definitely felt empathy and sympathy for the survivors and for the victims and families and the communities, both the school communities as well as the larger communities that those schools were in. But it was always something that I kind of felt a little disconnected to, in the sense that although I didn't have sort of the naive assumption that it could never happen here at my child's school, it was still always something that I was a little bit disconnected with. So I was able to feel what I was feeling, but was able to function throughout my day. And then Newtown happened. And as we all may remember, Newtown happened on a Friday, and Monday morning came along, and my son was a freshman in high school at the time, and I had a really, really, really hard time sending him to school. So much so that we actually got in an argument that morning because I wanted to keep him home from school, and I thought, being the high school freshman that he was, that would be really easy, that I could just say to him, you have a free day off, and that would be the end of it. That was not the end of it. He really wanted to go to school. And so after a lengthy argument, I sent him to school. And I went to work, but I spent the entire day in a state of panic. Every time the phone rang, I got tears in my eyes. I started to sweat. I was convinced that that call was the call that was going to tell me that something like this had happened at his school and that he had been injured or worse. So convinced that I spent a lot of the day trying to figure out ways that I was now going to be able to quit my job and homeschool him for the rest of his schooling career, because I sincerely believed that I was the only one that could now keep him safe, and that if I sent him to school, I couldn't keep him safe. And what I realized very quickly, for very many reasons, was that keeping my adolescent home and trying to homeschool him at the time was not the best option for either one of us, and was not really going to happen. So I needed to do some work around how I was feeling and what I was now thinking, and my view of the world, which we'll come back to in a little bit. But how my view of the world and whether or not my child could be safe in the world, how that had shifted for me so much so that it was now really negatively impacting how I was functioning in sort of the daily stuff that I needed to do. So I offer that because one of the things that really surprised me about it was I had been in the field for a while. I had done trainings, not only attended, but also delivered trainings on secondary traumatic stress. I thought I was doing a really good job of taking care of myself, and then I experienced this impact. And what it really allowed was it allowed me to really open my eyes and recognize that this impact that I was experiencing was not because I was less than as a clinician, or that I wasn't really integrating the information that I was learning or that I was training on into my everyday practice, and essentially that it wasn't my fault that I was reacting this way, but that, as Rebecca mentioned before with trauma, that I was having a pretty typical reaction to an abnormal or an atypical event. So I just offer that because one of the things I think is really important is recognizing that we can be in this field for a short amount of time or a long amount of time. We can be doing various things in this field, and we can sort of get bitten by this compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress bug. So I offer that as a sort of a starting off point for all of us to think about this piece. So the next thing we're going to do is take a little stress test. So for you guys, this is actually really simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the next slide. And on the next slide is a picture of two dolphins. And what we've seen from this test is that folks who are experiencing higher levels of stress see more differences in the two dolphins than those who are experiencing lower levels of stress in the moment. So what I want you all to do is, when I click the screen, is just take a look at the picture and notice for yourself, does it seem like that the amount of differences that you're noticing between the two dolphins, does that match with the level of stress that you're feeling right now, or does it feel like it's off a little bit? So I'm going to give everyone a minute to sort of take in this screen. And before I go any further, what I will say, just in case there's anybody out there that's really freaking out and thinking, oh my God, there's so many differences, I am a goner as far as stress is concerned. What I will first say is that this is actually a picture of a dolphin and a cow, not two dolphins. But the reason why I do this is, one, this was actually not a real research test, so I just want to put that out there as well. But this is on here for a couple of reasons. The first one is because typically we get laughter from this, and so hopefully there were some folks that were sitting at their desks and saw this and had a little chuckle around it. And the reality is that we need to have humor. We need to be able to laugh. We need to be able to joke. We really need to be able to find humor in what we do. That's a really, really great way of being able to sustain ourselves and being able to de-stress. So I really try and incorporate some laughter and some humor when I'm out talking with folks about this topic. The second reason why I do it is because the reality is that we all have stress. We all have sort of just the day-to-day stress that goes along with our jobs. We all have stress that's related to our families, whether it's kids or significant others or housing stuff or financial stuff, but we all have stress. And if you ever meet anybody that tells you that they're not experiencing any stress whatsoever, what I will tell you right now is they're probably not telling you the truth, because we all have stress. And the thing about us as humans, and I would even go so far as to say as even us as humans living in this American society, is that we don't really have a great way of de-stressing. So we don't really have a great way of getting rid of our stress. And so when we experience the stress that we experience, it starts to accumulate and starts to build up. So unlike other animals, like for instance, they have a really good way of releasing their stress. So a deer, if you've ever seen a deer that's been involved in a stressful situation, whether it's because they've jumped out in front of your car or they come upon a predator in the woods, when a deer has gone through that moment where they have to bring up their survival skills and then that threat is over, before they do anything, before they go on, they shake their whole bodies. Like they literally shake it all out. And what that does is it allows them to re-regulate themselves and to come back to a state of calm and a state of regulation so that they can then go on and go off into the woods and do whatever it is that deer do. So for us, I think it's really about learning ways to shake it off. So one of the things that I actually really love to do, and I do sometimes when I'm in a training, is I will take out Taylor Swift's Shake It Off song, and I will literally shake it off. So I'll shake my whole body, kind of like I'm doing the hokey pokey, and just shake it all out. So I offer that for you maybe when this webinar is over, to go sort of on the computer and find her song maybe and just listen to a minute of it and just shake it all off. So the other reason why we talk about this is because of this fabulous quote by Rachel Remen. And this is where we really bring in the increased stress or the added stress that we have that's related to the work that we do. And so what she says so beautifully is that the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And when I sit with that, it really is so rich to me, because for a long time in this field, we had this conversation about self-care and about compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, but it felt very much like it was a us-them. Like there are those people that get this, there are those people that experience secondary traumatic stress, maybe they're not taking care of themselves, maybe they shouldn't be in this job or doing this work. And what we've really started to see in the research and over the years is that this work has what we call occupational hazards. And experiencing compassion fatigue is one of those occupational hazards. And we have this occupational hazard because of what Rachel says here, in the sense that we can't be immersed in this. We can't be working with folks who've experienced suffering and loss and trauma and expect that we're just going to be able to go about our lives and not be impacted by it at all. So for all those reasons, we are really having this conversation today. So, but before we go any further, the next thing that I want to touch on briefly goes back to a little bit about what Rebecca was saying at the beginning. And so we want to understand, we want to remember, and we want to build. So what we want to understand is that when you're in an interaction with somebody, and maybe it's a challenging interaction and you're getting some negative responses, that most of the time that negative response that you're getting really doesn't have to do with you or with what you are doing in that interaction. a lot of the times the reaction that you're getting or the response that you're getting has to do with all of the stuff that's gone on for that person that day, the previous couple of days, the previous few years, even as far back as into their childhood. So being able to sort of hold on to that and know that what you're getting is not necessarily about you is a really great way to depersonalize it and not make it about you, so that you then don't go to this place of, now I have to figure out how to fix it for this person. The second thing we want to do is hold on to remembering, and this goes right back to what Rebecca was saying about the child who was having an adaptive response in one situation, and it was that same response was actually a maladaptive response in another situation. And that is remembering that what we're seeing in folks, what we're seeing as far as reactions with either children or families that we're working with, that a lot of the times those skills that they're going to are skills that worked for them in another situation or in another time of their lives, and they're really comfortable with that coping skill, and so that's why they go back to it. And so some of the times when we're seeing choices that folks are making, and we may be scratching our heads wondering, why are they going back to that again, or why are they doing this piece again, or we've talked about that it's not about them being a bad person, it's not about that they're not getting it or that they don't want to get it. A lot of times it's about that they're feeling unsafe for some reason, not necessarily that you're doing anything unsafe, but they're just in a moment of maybe where their survival skills are going up, and so they are turning to a coping skill that in another situation or at another time really worked for them, and it's probably or maybe not a coping skill that works so well in the interaction that you're in with them. And then the last thing that we want to do is we want to build on other people's desires to fix things, as well as other people's desires to really care about others. And so what I mean by that is when I work with families and with parents, a lot of times it can be really challenging because they may be, again, making choices or decisions that I don't agree with, that I don't understand, sometimes that I think are not the right decisions. And I really scratch my head because I wonder sort of what's going on. But what I will say is that in all of the interactions that I've had with families, and in all of those interactions when there have been times where I feel like they've been making choices that I don't agree with, what I always know and what I've never, what I've always known about these families and the experience I always have is that these are families that really love and care about their kids. They may not be able to, say, parent in a way that's really healthy or safe or adaptive or appropriate for their kids in that moment, but it's not because they don't love their kids. It's not because they don't want to succeed. It's not because they are not trying. It's really because they just are having a really hard time knowing how to do it. And so if I can build on that family's desire around them loving and really wanting to keep their kids safe, then when I come at the interaction, I can come at it from a more, with a more open view. The other sort of second piece to this is about working with colleagues and having the recognition that for a lot of us that are in this helping profession, we're in this helping profession because we want to help people and because we really like to fix things. And oftentimes we're really good at fixing things. And when folks come into our offices or when they come to work with us and they present us with a situation or a problem, we want to be able to jump in and we want to be able to offer them resources and support and be able to fix it for them. And what we need to recognize is that sometimes what they're not looking for is us to fix it. Sometimes, even if we can see the answer right there, even if we can just say to them, but if you just do this, this will make it better, sometimes that's not what they're looking for. They just need us to say, wow, I'm really sorry that you're going through that. That sounds tough. And so being able to understand, remember, and build on those things is one of the beginning ways that we can really help sustain ourselves as we continue to do this work. So before we talk about kind of specific strategies for managing and addressing secondary trauma and vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, all of these terms that you keep hearing us talk about, I'm going to spend a little bit of time defining them. So we want to start with this idea of compassion. Compassion satisfaction is really the pleasure we derive from being able to do our work well. It's also, your level of compassion satisfaction is also the thing that's going to offset and combat levels of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. So the higher our compassion satisfaction, the more pleasure we are deriving from our work, the more meaning we find in the work, the more positive feelings we have about our work, the less likely we are to be as heavily impacted by things like vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And in a lot of ways, compassion satisfaction and fatigue are opposite. And towards the end of our webinar, we'll talk a little bit about a measure that you can actually use to measure where is your compassion satisfaction versus where is your compassion fatigue. And so I just want to ask people, again, we're trying to kind of encourage people to practice some things, even though we can't see you and maybe hear your voice, but to think about what made today a good day for you professionally. Everyone take a moment and think about one thing that's happened between, some of you are earlier in your days than we are, and maybe you're just getting to work, but think about one thing professionally already that's happened that made today a good day. If you're one of the people that's having a really lousy day, I would suggest think about something that may be a little less lousy. What is, an okay thing that happened today? And so holding this in your mind and being able to reflect on this is another strategy that we really talk about in terms of being able to carry a higher level or build compassion satisfaction over time. And so it's really important that we're constantly trying to kind of feed the compassion satisfaction bank. And we're going to talk about a number of ways that we do that. So the other concept is kind of related but not the same, is this idea of burnout. Oftentimes I'll hear people in helping professions, people who work with in the field of violence, talking about burnout. So-and-so's burned out, I'm feeling burnout. And it's very true that many people in helping professions can experience burnout, but it's also true that burnout's actually something that can happen to anyone in any profession. So you can be a computer systems analyst, you can be an investment banker, and you can experience burnout. So it's different from what we're talking about a little bit more in depth today, in terms of it's different from secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. It's related, but it's not the same, and sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. So burnout is this state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion caused by long-term involvement in emotionally demanding situations. We think about it of the smoldering of a fire or extinguishing of a candle. When you think about your professional life as either a fire or a candle, that, when you're new in a field or new to a position, you have a lot of energy, you're excited, you're gung-ho, you're motivated, and that over time, this gradual draining of energy can happen where you have more of a smoldering, or even at the worst places, an extinguishing of that candle. And so it's associated oftentimes with feelings of hopelessness and difficulty in dealing with work or in doing your job effectively. The other thing that we want to do to distinguish burnout from secondary trauma is that burnout is it has a gradual onset. So where secondary trauma, which we'll talk about, can have a very sudden onset or gradual, that burnout is almost always a gradual onset over time. It's oftentimes due to factors such as the following. Things that have a lot to do with maybe an unsupportive work environment, feeling ineffective in one's job, feeling a lack of purpose, thinking about when we're not feeling like we're getting recognition, when we feel like we don't have positive connections or relationships in our work life, feeling like there's inequities or that there is a conflict in our work with our personal ethics and morals. And also this idea that, many of us could probably relate to this workload suggestion, where we work in under-resourced organizations or fields, but yet have very high workloads. And that is often a contributing factor to burnout. Also, just this idea of accountability and influence. Do we feel like we have influence over what we're being held accountable for? And so when there are mismatches in this, when there's a lack of fit between these things, that's what causes this kind of gradual onset of burnout. So while burnout is very related to secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, it is not the same. So compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are really things that are unique to helping professions and unique to work that involves contact with either content or people or systems that are experiencing suffering or impacted by trauma. And so compassion fatigue, and I know everyone can read the slide, but just to hear it, is the emotional distress one may experience when having had close contact with a trauma survivor. So this term was first put forth by Charles Figley, who's considered kind of the father of the study of compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. And he first used the term secondary traumatic stress in 1983 to describe this very same concept. He changed this term later to compassion fatigue because it was less stigmatizing than secondary traumatic stress. So go figure that while we're working with people who've experienced trauma, providers felt somewhat stigmatized by trying to identify that, yes, I may be experiencing something called secondary traumatic stress. But what we're really talking about are very similar concepts. In 1992, Carla Joynson, who was a nurse, used this term when she was researching emergency room nurses after noticing loss in ability to remain empathic. So if you think about the term fatigue of compassion or compassion fatigue, it literally means when we work in a field that calls for us to be compassionate in our day-to-day interactions with the clients that we serve, that this ability can be fatigued over time. And we're going to talk about the factors that can kind of fatigue that piece. But it's a weakening from the ability to be compassionate over time. And it often results from this repeated exposure to people's experiences or stories of suffering and loss and trauma. So again, when we think about this in relationship to compassion satisfaction, we always want to be building our compassion satisfaction and trying to decrease our levels of compassion fatigue. Another term that you've heard us use interchangeably is the idea of vicarious trauma, which is the transformation in the self that results from empathic engagement with traumatized clients. So while compassion fatigue is kind of what happens over time in our ability to be compassionate or to connect with our clients, vicarious trauma really has to do with the changes within ourselves. So it's associated with a change in a view of ourselves and how we see the world and environment. So I'll give you, again, we like to celebrate in the spirit of Brene Brown, who many of you may know, is a shame researcher, a social worker, and she does a lot of research on shame. She always talks about celebrating vulnerability. And I think when we're talking about secondary trauma and vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, it's really important that we put ourselves out there and celebrate vulnerability in the interest of figuring out ways to support one another and sustain ourselves in the work. So in that essence, I just want to kind of share a brief personal story about when my first job outside of undergraduate school many years ago, I was working in close contact with many children who'd experienced childhood sexual abuse and assault. And in doing this work, and without having any idea what secondary trauma was or vicarious trauma was, and not probably being way over my head in the work I was doing, I began to, in working with these children, start to see the world in a different way. And one of the ways that happened was I literally used to look around and kind of wonder which one of the males, either in my life or just kind of in my environment, were potential perpetrators of childhood sexual abuse. And it was this kind of shift in my world perspective and a jaded view of the world that came from working in close contact with children who had experienced childhood sexual abuse. And at the time, I really had no skills to manage that change in perspective or really even know how to identify it. So I just share that to think about how sometimes doing our work does change how we see ourselves. It can change how we see the world. And it's why it's important to be talking about this so we can build skills so that that doesn't happen to us or it doesn't happen to the same degree, and we know ways to management. So think about vicarious trauma not as something that's static, not a static process, but something that's more dynamic. So as humans, we're always changing, our perspectives are always shifting, and so is our level of vicarious trauma. So the way our work impacts us in one moment may not be the same way that it impacts us next week or a month down the road. And so we want to be thinking about all of these concepts kind of as dynamic and not something that once you have vicarious trauma, it's there to stay. You can never get rid of it. You can never manage it. But something that shifts depending on where we are in the work. And so finally, this term that probably brought a lot of you to this webinar and what we've been talking about is secondary traumatic stress. And this is the natural consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowledge about a traumatizing event experienced by another. It is the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person. So this is where when we're talking about secondary traumatic stress, we're talking about the actual stress reactions that are consequent to working with people who have experienced trauma. This is the occupational hazard. It's these stress reactions that are the occupational hazard that requires us to take certain precautions and develop certain skills to decrease our levels of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. So as we move forward, we're kind of talking about what some of these reactions look like. How do we know if we have secondary traumatic stress? What do we do to manage it? And thinking about these are the reactions that do kind of pose those hazards in our work. And again, thinking about what are those skills that we use to manage hazards on the job. The same way that someone entering a construction site, given our title, might put a hard hat on to protect themselves from falling objects, we need to develop certain skills to manage this occupational hazard of secondary traumatic stress. So the last term that we'll just touch on really briefly is a newer term that comes from Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, who is another social worker turned researcher who does a lot around secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. She has a fabulous book called Trauma Stewardship, and that resource is also at the end of the slides that you can take a look at. But she came up with this term called trauma exposure response. And she does a lot of work not only with those who are working maybe one-on-one or interacting as far as sort of with families who have been exposed to violence and trauma, but she also does a lot of work with veterinarians and with environmental protectionists. And what she has come across is that the reactions that they experience related to being exposed to the suffering that they're exposed to is really sort of on par and really mirrors a lot of the reactions that that she was seeing in clinicians or advocates or case managers or case workers who were really having that sort of one-on-one interaction with folks who have experienced trauma. So what we're really seeing in the field is that there's this transformation, as Laura says, there's this transformation that takes place within us as a result of exposure to the suffering of other living beings or the planet. And she goes on to talk about that this can result from either deliberate or inadvertent exposure, and we'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about risk factors, as well as formal or informal contact and paid or volunteer work. So what we're really, really recognizing is that being in this field, being in this helping profession, really has an impact on us. So I feel like it's always helpful to just see a little bit of statistics around how much is this impacting folks. So there's actually 3 slides that I'm going to sort of move through. I'm not going to go through every single study, but what you'll notice is that we have studies with social workers, child welfare workers, nurses. We have studies with juvenile justice education workers, DV and SA, social workers and advocates. We have one that was done related to hospice nurses, animal care workers, and even chaplains who were working in New York City after 9/11. And what we noticed from a lot of the numbers is that anywhere from like 40 to 50, even sometimes as high as 70 or 90% of folks are either extremely high risk for compassion fatigue or in some of the cases are actually meeting at least one core criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And what the research goes on to further say is that anywhere between 10 to about 40% of folks are meeting all of the core criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. So they could walk into a clinician's office and be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so again, what we're really recognizing based on these numbers is that this is really something that's impacting us. This is really something that is this occupational hazard. So when we take a step back and sort of think about that for a minute, let's go back to that construction worker idea. So what we know is that construction workers have occupational hazards. They have things that they know when they go onto the job site could potentially happen to them. One of the examples is this poor guy who's on the screen right now, who's on the floor, who got maybe hit in the leg with a 4x4 or a 2x4 and is really hurting. We know that sometimes folks can get hit in the head with things. They can, if they're anything like me and really accident prone, they would shoot a nail through their foot with a nail gun. So there's all kinds of things that can happen to a construction worker when they go on the job site. What we also know about construction workers is that they have things in place to help prevent accidents from happening and to help support them if and when an accident happens. So some of the things that we know they do are, again, from the title of our of this talk, they put on hard hats, they put on steel-toed boots, they have safety goggles. They don't ever go onto a job site without a buddy. So they don't go on alone, so that if something were to happen to them, there's somebody there who can make sure that they're getting them the help and the support and the resources that they need. Even before construction workers go onto a job site, there's a whole governing board that steps in, OSHA, and looks at the job site and says, yes, you've done everything you need to do to help make this job site the safest it can be, and you have policies and procedures in place so that if and when an accident happens, because they know that just having hard hats and policies and procedures and safety goggles isn't going to prevent an accident. So they know that there are policies and procedures in place so that when an accident happens, that person can really get some support. So my goal in life is to create an OSHA for the helping profession and be able to have a way that we have sort of a governing board that's coming in and saying, here's what's set up for you to do your job and to sustain yourself in this job and take care of yourself. And when you're struggling, when you're impacted by it, here's what we have in place to help you. But until we have that national governing board, we need to do that for ourselves. So the first place is to really start with building awareness. And we build awareness by learning a little bit about what we're talking about, which Rebecca went over. And the next step is to look at what are some of the risk factors. So the risk factors that are on these lists are really interesting because most of them on here, like it says with the empathy one, are really double-edged swords. So when we think about that, what we know is that in order to do our jobs, we have to be exposed to people, right? We have to be exposed to people. We have to be exposed to their stories. We have to be exposed to what's going on. So we know that automatically that's a risk factor. And this isn't just exposure where if you have somebody sitting in front of you telling you their story, that certainly is included. But we also know, especially with kids, that they let us know what's going on for them in all kinds of different ways. So we might be seeing it in their behaviors. We might be exposed to it by the play that they're doing or by what they're drawing out. So there's that exposure piece. But there's also the exposure piece of stuff that we get exposed to every day that is different from how we had that exposure, maybe let's say when I was a child. So when I was a child, when something bad would happen in the world, we would typically hear about it on the 6 o'clock news. And that was when we heard about it, and that's when we heard the story, and we had to wait maybe until the 11 o'clock news to hear more, and then the next morning to hear more. Nowadays, we have exposure in all kinds of ways. I imagine, just like myself, there's a lot of you out there who, within a half an hour to 45 minutes after the Boston Marathon bombings occurred, we knew about it. And then we kept being exposed to it over and over again. When we think about 9/11, I mean, how many times did we see those towers fall? A number of times. And then every year at anniversary time, we're exposed to that again. So one of the ways that we can really help ourselves is to decrease the exposure where we can, knowing that there's other places where we have to be exposed to that material. Another risk factor is interaction. So again, we need to be able to interact with folks in order to do our jobs. We can't do them without that interaction. And interaction can be really positive, but interaction can also be challenging. And not just if that specific interaction is really challenging because you're getting resistance from a client or a family or it's just a real struggle, but also, also the interaction that is really related to sometimes in the work that we do, we don't get to see the end story. right? So we're working with a child or a family, and we're working with them for a specific amount of time, and then we don't have the ability to be able to see what happens after and how they may recover from it. So that can be challenging. Lack of experience, we know that if we have less time in the field, then chances are we're going to have less trainings, we're going to have been exposed to less information, so that becomes a risk factor. Personal trauma history, we know that this is a risk factor. Even if you've done all the work you need to do around it, there's trauma reminders and there's triggers, and so we know that that can be a risk factor. And then finally, there's that piece of empathy. And again, this is another one of those double-edged swords, because what we know is that we need to be empathetic to do our jobs. We need to be able to have those empathic responses. But we also know that being empathetic is really about, as Rebecca was talking about, it's about being vulnerable. It's about opening ourselves up. And there's a great, before I go on to talk about the specific impacts, there's a great video by Brene Brown where if you just type in Brene Brown empathy, it'll come up. That really talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy and how empathy really impacts what we do. But recognizing that empathy is really about this vulnerable connection that we're making with somebody, and that that in and of itself becomes a risk factor. So I'm not going to go through all the personal or the professional impacts bit by bit, but just if you look down this list to maybe start to notice, do you recognize some of these in yourself, and do you maybe recognize some of these in others that you're working with? We know that this impacts us on the physical, emotional, relational, spiritual, and cognitive levels, both personally as well as professionally. And so again, it's about just recognizing that if you're experiencing some of these, it might be time to sort of do a little bit of soul searching and maybe think about where you are sort of on that compassion fatigue and sort of where you are if you're struggling. And so the one thing that I just want to sort of make clear is we all have days where we experience one or more of these impacts. We all have days where we feel exhausted, or maybe we're feeling negative, or any of those things. And so this is really about, is it a change, is it a shift, and is it increased, and is it impacting you negatively in multiple areas? So when we think about managing secondary traumatic stress, again, a lot of what you're going to see here we've talked about and will continue to talk about. So building awareness. So doing things like attending webinars, attending trainings, doing a little bit of research on it. All of those are great ways to be able to build awareness on what this is and how it is. Building awareness is also about building awareness around your own personality as well, about knowing, are you somebody who's typically more you can let things roll off your back really easily, or are you somebody where things kind of tick you off a lot? So knowing things like that about yourself is going to help you as you go into interactions with folks. Being able to avoid self-care pitfalls. So we all have things that we do for self-care. We all have things that we like to do to take care of ourselves. And we also have different reasons that are really valid reasons and solid reasons of why we may not be doing those self-care things. So things like time, things like money, things like I have no interruption. And yeah, I see that you want to interrupt for a second.
Hi, I'm sorry. There's someone who has their line unmuted. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone's line, Rebecca and Allegra. I'm sorry, but can you unmute yourselves after I do that? I apologize, but the noise is very distracting.
Sure.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line, but you are no longer muted.
Okay, you should be able to go now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So, it's really about going to those pitfalls and figuring out, is it time, is it energy, is it money, what is it, and then being able to find some specific things and some concrete things that you can do to really help you move through that pitfall. So one of mine really quickly is that if I don't write something down, then to me it's sort of not set in stone. So I feel like that I can often schedule things over maybe my self-care thing. So one of the things that I've really started doing is I write down when I want to do something self-care in my day planner so that if somebody asks me to do something, I can go to that and I know it's written down and I can say, sorry, I'm booked, can I do that for you at a different time? So thinking about what are those pitfalls for you. Building and maintaining connections. We've talked about this a little bit already and we'll continue to talk about this, but having connections is so important, both personally and professionally. And this is really important because in this job that we do, we have confidentiality. So that limits what we can say when we go home and we're talking to our partners or our significant others about our challenging day. It limits what we can say. And so that can be challenging because sometimes we need to be able to just spew all the details. So having that connection within your work, either in colleagues and or with supervisors, is really, really important. But also having the connections outside of work is important so that you can really disconnect from the job. Knowing your triggers, so this comes back to not only if you have a personal trauma history, but also just knowing what your typical buttons are, what sort of bugs you, and being able to know that about yourself. And then finally, finding inspiration. So coming back to what Rebecca started with, about really finding what motivates you. And I think you'll see the next slide is a little cartoon about somebody who was having a sense of purpose and then really is just talking about, I'm fine, it was just a fleeting sense of purpose and I'm sure it will pass. And really what we want to do is we don't want to think about that in that way. We want to be able to connect with our sense of purpose and why we're doing this and why we keep coming back to the job. So I'm not going to have you guys do this now, but I want you sort of just to hold on to this and think about maybe if you have a couple minutes after the webinar is over, to think about doing one or more of these. And what this helps do is it helps come back to your motivation. If you can remember how you did your job and how you did it well, then being able to come back to that, especially at times when you're really struggling, is really, really, really helpful. So again, I would offer when this webinar is over, at some other point today, take a few minutes to write down a really rewarding moment from your job or write down a compliment that you've received from somebody and then put that somewhere where you can really see it so that you can really come back to it. So that if you're having a really challenging day, you really know that you can come back to this thing that helps you manage what's going on for you and helps you be able to remember why you started this work. So another way to sort of think about this is thinking about in the sense of how do we do this? So we know what this looks like. We know how it's going to impact us. We know what our risk factors are. So and we know sort of, we'll talk in a minute about some things that we can specifically do, but what are some things that we do that are like brushing our teeth or putting on our seatbelt so that every day we're building our personal resiliency? So, and again, I'm not going to go through every single one of these specifically because we've talked a lot about them already. Countering isolation. Again, this is a hard job that we do. And so thinking that we can do it alone or do it in isolation without support, without supervision is, I think, really discredits us and really presents some significant challenges. So we need to be able to do this work with others and connect with others. Building mindful awareness. So again, not just awareness about things that trigger you, but awareness about your typical personality type and what things bother you and what things you can sort of just let roll off your back. And also looking at ways to really stay in that moment and really be mindful. There's a lot of stuff right now out about mindfulness and about how they're using it in schools and how beneficial it is. So really coming right back into that for ourselves as well. Embracing complexity. This is a tough one. Being able to look at a situation and recognize that it's a really complex situation and that there are some things that we're going to be able to help with and some things that we're not going to be able to help with. And so it's really about maintaining what is our role in this situation and what can I do and then who can I connect to this person to that can help with some of the other challenges that they're experiencing. And thinking about optimism. So again, are you typically a glass half full or are you a glass half empty person? And how can you find optimism? And not just optimism in your everyday, but optimism in a situation, finding resilience in a situation, in a person that you've worked with, especially when it's a challenging situation. Being able to find that optimism and resilience is really important. Things like holistic health care, so thinking not just about physical and emotional mental health care, but thinking about spiritual health care. So thinking about what it is that feeds your soul and how do you connect with that. Thinking about aesthetic health care, so thinking about how do you make your surroundings beautiful to you. Is it pictures? Is it the way that you keep your desk or your office? So thinking about how to make something really pleasing to the eye for you. Setting limits and boundaries. This is a tough one. A lot of us have a really hard time saying no. But being able to say no and set those limits and boundaries, both personally as well as professionally, can be really, really helpful, especially because we know that there are times where you can't say no. And so during the times that you can, it's really important to be able to do that. We've talked about empathic engagement and discernment, so figuring out the most empathic response that's for the person you're working with as well as for yourself. Satisfaction with the job, again, a lot of this goes towards burnout, but again, thinking about, do you like your job, or do you get up every morning sort of really struggling with going to work because you don't like your job? That's a huge piece. And then finally, making meaning. So again, coming back to not sort of the silver lining, so not the, well, that bad thing happened, but at least this came out of it, or at least this didn't happen, but being able to look at that event or that bad thing that happened and say, but here's how I'm stronger after it. Here's what I gained having gone through that. So doing all of those things are ways that we can really build our resiliency. And as Rebecca mentioned before, resilience is really the antidote to compassion fatigue. So just kind of building upon what Allegra was talking about in terms of all of these wonderful strategies to manage compassion fatigue, to address secondary traumatic stress, thinking about building our own resiliency as providers and just as people. Just again, I think we probably sound like a broken record, but we can't emphasize enough the importance that compassion and empathy play in our work and our ability to be effective with those who've experienced trauma. And, you know, this idea that service providers, you know, that exposure, while we talked about it as a risk factor, can also be a place of inspiration. It can be where we find that meaning that we've been talking about. We can feel proud about the work we do. We can feel proud about a particular intervention or policy that we were able to change on behalf of people exposed to violence. Any of those things can be considered exposure, but can be a step towards making meaning in the work that we're doing. Thinking about, you know, taking a moment to staying focused on your goal and improving this empathic engagement and discernment. And so just to define that a little bit, empathic discernment was it was quoted to mean accurately selecting and using the best empathic response for both client and self. And it's this idea of, you know, oftentimes when we're talking about secondary trauma, we talk about you need to bring your emotional armor. And this idea of that we need to create some armor to help mitigate the impact of the exposure to trauma. And that's a fine analogy. What I like to think about when we talk about it is more of a sense of the idea of chainmail. Because if we have armor, the ability to connect and be compassionate and truly empathize is somehow is impeded in a way if we have this really strong armor, this wall, or this force field around us. When we think about the concept of, let's say, chainmail from medieval times, chainmail was mesh, right? So it provided some protection, but it also had holes in it. And that's kind of one of the analogies that I like to use in doing this work is thinking about we need to be able to connect and be empathic. We need to be able to let some of the content come in and start to make sense of it and process it for ourselves, but we don't want to let it all in. Thinking about this continuum, when we become too engaged in someone's story or in the experience of others, we're no longer effective in our professional roles, usually, I would say. And we're also at that point at greater risk of secondary trauma. When we're not engaged enough in empathy, we're not effective either. And so thinking about what is that balance between how much, you know, how much do we integrate someone's experience, you know, bear witness to their story without letting it totally flood us and become completely engaged in it. And one way of improving empathic discernment is through this idea of reflective practice. So I'm just going to take a couple minutes to talk about this. This idea of reflective practice. So reflective practice was first coined by Schoen in 1983, 1987, and he basically did studies that really identified the messiness of the work we do. in helping professions. So he identified two theories, reflection in practice and reflection on practice. Reflection in practice is really, what is it that what are we learning as we're applying learning from our current and past experiences in the moment? So when you're in the moment in your work, whatever it may be, let's say it's in direct care, or maybe it's in the management of a program, all of the things that you're calling upon in any given moment to inform the decision or the action you're about to make. That would be reflection in practice, your ability to take pause and reflect on past experiences and the current environment is what we're talking about. And then there's reflection on practice. And reflection on practice is really about the experience and learning we get from it's after the experience has happened. So once we've been through, let's say, an interaction, or we've had a meeting, or we've read those 4 studies on, childhood exposure to domestic violence, what is the learning we derive when we reflect back on the professional experience? So you can have both and both are really important as we learn and grow through our professional experiences. And why this is important is because it's these two processes that allow us to reshape approaches and develop wisdom and artistry. And I just want to take a moment and kind of highlight that or underline that word artistry. There may be some of us on this webinar today who have, an artistic side, a creative side to them. I do not at all consider myself an artist, but I think we all have that creative spirit in us as humans. And we're in a field where it really provides for creativity, maybe not in, what we kind of classically think of as art forms, but we have room for creativity. No two relationships that we have in our lives are the same. And so that means every relationship, every connection we build and engage in has the opportunity to be different, and we can be creative with those relationships. It's, the other thing to think about is that creativity is actually a protective factor, a coping skill for addressing and managing secondary trauma. Allegra may talk about as we move forward, but this idea that tapping into the creative place of our brain actually helps us manage or address or combat secondary traumatic stress. And so we can do this in our work, in our day-to-day. So we want to try to build reflective practice skills. And some of, these are kind of highlighted here for you, but I just want to take a moment in terms of thinking about how in our work are we, whether with our colleagues or whether it's the people we serve, how are we building a sense of safety in our relationships? How are we using observation as a tool? When we use observation, we actually remove judgment. We highlight perspective, and when we remove judgment, we're able to attend to the issue at hand or the interaction at hand in kind of a more removed and objective way. We want to focus on the process. What are the moments to let go of? There are those times in a relationship where we need to let go of our agenda, where we need to take pause and really kind of release the outputs that we're trying to get to and just focus on the moment. This idea of a conscious use of self. What does it feel like to be in an experience with a client or an experience with a colleague? What are we experiencing? That idea of self-awareness and reflection is so important in addressing secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. Exploring differences, this idea that the idea of difference and even the idea of conflict don't have to be dirty words to us. They can actually be opportunity. So as we explore differences within our teams, within our organizations, between ourselves and our clients, it leads opportunities for connections and relationships. And so I actually think about this issue of conflict, and I think about, some of our most important relationships in our lives have many differences and many conflicts. Think about your relationships with your significant others or your spouse, your family. Some of those relationships tend to be those in our lives that hold some of the most conflict, but they're also some of the strongest relationships that we have in our lives. And so that's just to say that difference and conflict is not necessarily bad. It oftentimes gives opportunity for growth and actually stronger connection. And then regulation of emotion, I think we've talked a lot about this, but this probably one things that is a key to managing secondary trauma. How do you know when you're dysregulated? And when you do feel yourself becoming dysregulated, what do you then do about it? Relationship rupture and repair. So this is, this is a relational cycle. We can have relationships, we can have ruptures in those relationships, and the opportunity to repair and see kind of on the other side of that repair what happens with those relationships is one of the most important things in terms of managing that secondary trauma, because oftentimes when we're experiencing high levels of compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress, we have an absence of connection. Or we've got a rupture in a relationship. And so it's about healing those and repairing those to move us through those experiences. Briefly, just acknowledging the impact that our values, our own values and beliefs have on ourselves as a work. So what is already there that that we can't control for in our systems? I think about when we think about acknowledging the possible impacts of values and biases, most of our service systems operate under the auspices that everyone is literate, right? So we have materials that we hand out, we have information that we give. If I'm not going to change that system, that we make the assumption that people can read our materials if I'm kind of doing direct service. So we want to identify what can we control, what can't we, and how do we want to acknowledge some of the biases that occur in any given service system. We want to encourage open discussion around areas of agreement and disagreement, and we need to know our own biases and our own triggers. And Allegra's already talked a lot about this, so I won't go into detail, but taking pause and reflecting on what is it that presses my buttons, what is it that causes me to become dysregulated, those are all steps towards reflective practice and important steps in addressing compassion fatigue. So just to wrap this idea up of reflection involves making time and opening up space for emotional and intellectual exploration, for not knowing, for perspective taking, for musing, and for a kind of playfulness that leads to creativity. Playfulness and creativity, it's really hard to be bogged down, I think, by compassion fatigue when we are feeling playful and creative. We're more likely to build up our satisfaction in those moments. And so how do you use self-reflection and reflective practice to address compassion fatigue? We maintain a stance of perspective taking over judgment. When we avoid judgment, we also tend to avoid some of our stronger negative emotional attribution to a certain scenario. So when we go more to a perspective taking over judgment, we get out of this tendency that all humans have to look at something as good versus bad. That's going to help in terms of as we address our compassion fatigue. We want to understand how personal experiences and beliefs influence our work. This is going to allow us to be better prepared to apply skills when we're most at risk for vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. We want to provide space for creativity as a self-care strategy, and we want to help with self-regulation. So this is important for maintaining wellness and emotional health just as humans, but also especially important for those of us working with people who have experienced trauma. And just as Allegra had meant earlier in terms of the meaning-making activity, we've just included a few reflective questions to get people thinking, or something that you could actually just put at your desk to kind of come back to. So when we think about reflective practice as one of the skills to addressing vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, and compassion fatigue, we want to offer you some potential do-it-yourself, in-the-moment questions to put you in a place to look at a situation in maybe in a more holistic way. So that's what these are. And so I know we've only got a few more minutes to cover some of our material. We will leave a few minutes for questions at the end, but I'm going to turn it back over to Allegra.
So just to finish up this, I think it's always helpful just to have a couple of concrete things that we know can be helpful when we're experiencing reactions and ways to be able to manage them, as well as ways to be able to continue to build our personal resiliency. So thinking about some of these things as very similar to how we think about brushing our teeth or putting on a seatbelt when we get in the car. We do it because we know that it can help prevent us from getting
harmed or from getting hurt, and so it's something that becomes our everyday thing. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these. A lot of these you may have seen before in readings or in other trainings that you may have attended, but just to pull out a couple of these. So recognizing that, that things like lavender and sage and citrus and the scent of those can be really, really calming, but also recognizing that that a lot of folks have challenges with fragrances and have allergies to fragrances, so it's not something where we can just spray lavender in our offices sometimes anymore. So thinking about out-of-the-box ways to get some of these fragrances. So, for example, getting a little bottle of oil, of lavender oil, and having that in your desk might be one of those ways. Thinking about taking a time out. So timeouts are not just for kids. They're really, really helpful for us. So can you tag out of a situation if you're really struggling with it? Can you ask somebody to step in for a moment so you can go outside, take a deep breath of fresh air, walk around the building for a minute, and just be able to re-regulate yourself? Having a self-care buddy. So having that person at work, much like a construction worker has their buddy, having that person at work who you can say to, here's what it's going to look like if I'm experiencing challenges, and here's what's going to be really helpful, and I'll be that self-care buddy for you. Taking vacations, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to leave town or spend money. You can do staycations, and it's really about disconnecting from the work, disconnecting from the job. Music is another great one. There's tons of research out there about how music does really wonderful things, and so listening to your favorite song, turning up the radio, dancing in your living room, all of those things are fabulous. And then last but not least, humor. And again, coming back to that piece of being able to laugh. There are some great statistics about humor. One of them is that laughter, when you laugh, it increases your immune-boosting hormones, and it increases your depression-suppressing hormones. And that benefit lasts for up to 45 minutes after you have finished laughing. So laughter does so much in the moment as well as has a continued impact. So being able to look at some of these and thinking about what are some of these that you can incorporate and what are some of these that you can do right now. So another thing to think about is if I were to walk away with sort of 3 steps, what would I walk away with? So the first one would be to increase your awareness, increase your information, increase your learning. Then the next step would be to identify. So identify one thing that you can do by next Tuesday. So in the immediate, one small thing that you can do in the immediate to help increase your resiliency and to help decrease some compassion fatigue that you may be feeling. And this is also identifying if there's a person that can help you do that, who that person is. And then the third step is deciding to do it and doing it. And there's a lot of research around if we write something down that we're much more likely to hold that promise to ourselves. There's a whole movement, the Because I Said I Would movement, that does that. So really being able to write down what you're going to do to decide to do it. And then again, finally, because there's so much humor, just this, this little cartoon about poor Steve here who's on his yoga mat and he picks up this phone anyway but is trying to tell someone that he's in the moment. So really being able to be in the moment when especially when you're taking care of yourself, really focusing on just that. And then finally, when why do we come back to why do we talk about all this? And it really comes back to what Confucius says so well here, which, just to paraphrase, is really in order to really help the world, we need to be able to start with ourselves. And so we really need to be offering ourselves as much compassion and empathy as we are offering those who we work with.
So just before we open it up to some questions, wanted to offer some people some resources to further your knowledge in this topic. So the Professional Quality of Life Screening is that tool that I mentioned at the beginning where you can actually measure your levels of burnout, compassion fatigue, and compassion satisfaction. And what I will say is if you take that and you see that your levels of maybe fatigue and burnout are higher, that no one go out and quit their jobs quite yet, because it's really meant to be just a snapshot to look at where you are in the given moment and what you need to feed to kind of build that compassion satisfaction up. So again, it's more of an assessment. It's not a decisive factor, not that anyone would do that, but just to keep that in mind, to think about as that's going to change over time. This is, again, not a static process. It's dynamic. Futures Without Violence, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network
has a specific page on secondary traumatic stress, which has a great list of resources and some fact sheets for different service systems. Trauma stewardship is Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky and Connie Burke, who we referenced earlier. For those of you in child welfare, you may be familiar with the Children's Trauma Institute, which has a curriculum called the Resilience Alliance that addresses this issue of secondary traumatic stress and resilience in child welfare staff, and then obviously Defending Childhood as a resource as well. So with that said, we want to, I guess, turn it over to you, Mi, or I don't see any questions particularly quite yet.
Maybe let's give folks a minute or so to write down questions.
Yes, if you have questions, please take a moment and type them into the chat box.
There's multiple people typing, so I have a feeling we'll have a question or two in just a moment, so people hang on. So I see one of the questions is related to information around secondary traumatic stress impacting productivity. And what I would say is that there's definitely a lot of research around compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress and burnout and how that really does negatively impact productivity. In fact, a recent study that I read talked about that the majority of folks, when they use sick time and when they call out using sick time, it's related to compassion fatigue and or secondary traumatic stress rather than related to having the flu or something like that. So we do know that it impacts workers being in the building. We also know that when folks are experiencing compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, that some of the reactions that they're experiencing are related to disconnecting from clients, not wanting to meet with clients, all those kinds of things. And so we know that that really impacts productivity as well. So there is a lot of research. I don't have specific statistics, but there is a lot of research around there about how it impacts that. I see another question around, as a supervisor or manager, how to promote resiliency in staff and help them from becoming burnt out. I think that there's a number of kind of strategies we talked about that you could encourage within your staff, but also just in thinking about your own management style and leading by example. So as a supervisor or manager, are you someone who is at the office for 13 hours a day and, you know, your staff doesn't feel like they can maybe set the boundaries that we're encouraging them to set? Do you take vacations? Do you encourage staff to take time away from work? Do you talk about in supervision how you're managing the secondary trauma as an occupational hazard? I think staff are oftentimes hesitant to come forward and acknowledge the experience for the fear that they're going to be looked at either as not competent, not able to do their job well, or maybe have that stigma attached to it. So when it becomes a conversation that is kind of a given within a given team or within a given supervisory relationship, I think that is one of the things that helps build resiliency and thinking about those pieces. I would also, just to add to that, that the pieces that Rebecca talked about as far as reflective supervision and bringing reflection into your supervisory practices is also another way that you can really help build some of that chain mail for those staff to where, so that when they're in interactions, they really have that piece. Yeah, so I see a question around there about programs and or organizations where it may be harder for them to be able to see that self-care is so important. And so, you know, that is a definite challenge, and it's a challenge where when we think about some of those things that we're not able to control, that would definitely be one of them. And so, you know, what I talk about is really continuing to have this conversation, really incorporate it into the work that you do, the practice that you do. If you're supervising folks, incorporate it into those pieces and continue to talk with those who are in those leadership roles about how important self-care is. Something that really helps, because I think a lot of the times leadership are really focused, because they have to be, are focused on keeping the program afloat, and so thinking about money, thinking about productivity, those things. So I think being able to offer some information for them about how compassion fatigue really impacts those things, so that they can see that it's something that's really important and that it's something that does really affect the bottom line.
I would also say that many organizations that work in the field of either childhood exposure violence or trauma are all have great focus on becoming more trauma-informed as an organization as a whole. And the field is really moving in that way, that to be considered a trauma-informed organization, you really need to be addressing the impact of trauma has on employees and employees within your organization. So that's another area, because that tends to be an organizational interest in the field as of yet, about becoming more trauma-informed. And this is one step towards that process. Okay. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. If anyone, you have our contact, or you have Futures contact if you need any additional resources.
Absolutely.
And please do the survey.
Great. And I want to thank you both so much for this fantastic webinar and information. Clearly, people are thinking about how to take it back to the larger staff. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy days. These are some of the ways that we fill ourselves back up when we pause to learn more and keep growing in our own work. And yes, please take a moment to fill out the survey. And as many of you mentioned, have a safe holiday weekend coming up. And thanks so much for joining us today.